Good evening and welcome to Capital Science Lecture. And congratulations for finding your way to an unusual venue for this lecture. As you know, this is normally held at the Carnegie Institution at P Street and 16th. And that the Rood Auditorium, where these lectures are normally held, is hosting another event. And so you all know this because here you are at the National Geographic in this wonderful auditorium. You probably also know that these lectures are normally introduced by Dick Meserve, the president of the Carnegie Institution, and I am not he. I am Sean Solomon, a director of one of the Carnegie departments. But I'm delighted to be able to pinch hit for him today to introduce today's speaker. Furthermore, I know precisely what he would have said in his introduction because he gave it to me. And so you could imagine that this is Dick Meserve, who is unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he's at the Carnegie Observatories in Chile and could not therefore be here readily tonight, but would have begun his introduction of our speaker by saying the following. In no other discipline of science do chemistry, biology, and astronomy intersect each other and popular culture more fully than in astrobiology. Astrobiology, as you probably know, addresses the origin, distribution, and evolution of life in the universe. Not modest. The prospect of life beyond Earth has been a matter of speculation for centuries. Only a half century ago, with the advent of the space program, could the search for extraterrestrial life begin in earnest. NASA funded its first program in astrobiology in 1959 with the development of an instrument designed to detect microbial life on Mars. That effort and subsequent efforts failed so far, but by the late 1990s, astrobiology had found firm footing at NASA with the creation of NASA's Astrobiology Institute. This institute is a virtual research organization comprising nearly a dozen research organizations, including the Carnegie Institution and the University of Colorado at Boulder, until recently, the home institution of our guest tonight. By the time the Astrobiology Institute was founded, the search for extraterrestrial life had broadened, focusing not necessarily on life itself, but on the conditions necessary for life to exist or have existed. This included conditions for the origin of life on the early Earth. Scientists realized that studies of the planets and other bodies in our solar system could reveal insights into our own planet as it was in the distant past. Scientists agree that Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago and that it teemed with life a billion or 2 years later, but great uncertainty surrounds the intervening time. Under what conditions on the early Earth life began remains a mystery. Particularly in question is the composition of Earth's earliest atmosphere. What combination of gases formed an environment hospitable to life? Recently, a new window opened on this question with a successful landing of the Cassini-Huygens probe on Titan, the largest moon of Saturn. Titan is the only body in the solar system that has an atmosphere remotely like that of Earth. This discovery prompted our guest, Dr. Margaret Tolbert, to explore the possible similarities between Titan's atmosphere and the atmosphere of the early Earth. Her simulation experiments have yielded provocative insights not only into Earth's first atmosphere, but into the sustainability of Earth's first life. Dr. Tolbert is a professor of chemistry and biochemistry at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She is also a fellow at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, a joint institute at the University of Colorado and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In addition to her work on Earth's early atmosphere, she studies how ice clouds and aerosols affect global ozone depletion and global climate on Earth today. Dr. Tolbert received her undergraduate degree from Grinnell College, her master's degree from the University of California at Berkeley, and her PhD from the California Institute of Technology, and all her degrees are in chemistry. Before joining the University of Colorado in 1991, she spent several years as a chemist at SRI International, where her work on the mechanism of the ozone hole in the Antarctic led to critical acclaim and earned her a Newcomb Cleveland Award from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. A member of the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Tolbert has earned many other honors and awards, including the 1993 James B. McIlwain Medal from the American Geophysical Union, a 1994 Dreyfus Teacher Scholar Award, 2 NASA Group Achievement Awards in 2001 and 2003, a 2005 Guggenheim Fellowship. In 2007, she received the Hazel Barnes Prize from the University of Colorado, which is the university's most prestigious faculty honor. And most recently, she received the 2009 American Chemical Society's National Award for Creative Advances in Environmental Science. So we have a very distinguished speaker tonight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Margaret Tolbert to speak to us on hazy skies on the early Earth, lessons from Saturn's moon, Titan. Margaret.
Wow, well, thank you, Sean, for that introduction, and thank you all for making your way here to share this evening with me. I'm going to be talking about 2 worlds today that seem very distant, but I think we'll see that in some ways these 2 worlds may be more alike than we might think. On the left, I show an artist's rendition of what early Earth might have looked like. And the first thing that you can see here is liquid water. And liquid water was thought to exist on Earth very shortly after the time of formation. Now, the other thing you can notice is that there's no real signs of macroscopic life in that picture. Over here, we have a picture of Titan. And Titan, as Sean said, is a moon of Saturn. And it's, in fact, the biggest moon of Saturn. And it's even bigger than the planet Mercury. So this is a big moon with a big atmosphere. The atmospheric pressure at the surface of Titan is about 1.5 times that of Earth. So there's a lot of air there. But what happens on Titan is that there's this organic haze layer that completely covers the entire moon. And because of that, we haven't been able to see what the surface of Titan looks like. So in this artist's rendition, we really didn't know what there was under this haze. And this artist is showing lakes. In this case, it's a methane lake, not a water lake, a methane waterfall. And there's Saturn in the background. Now, interesting, this picture does actually show signs of macroscopic life because you have the Cassini spacecraft here viewing Titan, and also the Huygens probe, which descended down into the Titan atmosphere and gave us our first real pictures of what the surface of Titan looked like. Okay, so I'm going to start out my talk today by talking about Titan. Now, this is not a picture of the Earth from Titan. It's a picture that probably many of you have seen. It's a picture of the Earth from the moon, which I then just colored so that it looked more like Titan. So I'm going to be starting by talking about Titan, and specifically I'm going to be focusing on the haze that surrounds Titan. And I'm going to go through some of our lab work to try and understand what this haze is made of and what it means. And then we're going to compare our laboratory studies to observations from Cassini and Huygens to see if there's any connection between what we do in the lab and what really exists. Then we're going to take that data and our understanding of the haze and see if we can apply this to other places. And in particular, I'm interested in talking about early Earth. Could there have been a haze on early Earth similar to that seen on Titan today? And if so, what would the implications of that haze be for the climate of early Earth, the habitability of early Earth, and life in general? I'm then going to take the last few moments of my talk and speculate a little bit about what this means. Could there be life on Titan, for example? Okay, so we're going to start with Titan. Titan, as I said, here it is. Ooh, let's go back. I don't know if yeah. Okay. Titan is a moon of Saturn, and there's been a lot of excitement in the news about Titan because of the Cassini mission to the Saturnian system. Now, Saturn is far from the Earth, so it took Cassini a long time to get to Titan, 7 years, and it arrived in June of 2004, and the Huygens probe descended into Titan's atmosphere in 2005. And so we're getting a lot of data just in the last few years about Titan. And just every few months there's some new discovery that you'll see in the news. And so you see this a lot. So I'm going to go through some of that today. Okay, well, this is a photograph here of Titan that was taken by Cassini. And the first thing that you can see is that Titan looks like this big orange ball. And that's because there's this organic haze layer that's completely surrounding the moon, and so you can't see through that haze to see what's on the surface. Now it's interesting, in this view here you get a really nice view of the haze. It's actually, you can see it's global, it's everywhere, but it's also in these layers. So there's an outer haze layer here at about 600 kilometers, and then there seems to be a gap, and then another haze layer maybe about 500 kilometers, and so that's quite interesting. Okay, well, how does this haze form? The atmosphere of Titan, as I said, is very thick. It's made of nitrogen with smaller amounts of methane. And actually, until the Huygens probe descended into the atmosphere, we weren't exactly sure how much methane there was. And we now know there's about 2% methane. So the atmosphere is similar to Earth's in some ways. Nitrogen's our most abundant gas also, but no oxygen, and here instead, quite a bit of methane. And what happens is that photochemistry, so sunlight or high-energy electrons, interact with this nitrogen-methane atmosphere, and they go through all sorts of complicated chemical reactions, and the result are these haze particles, which are then everywhere. So what we'd like to look at in our laboratory studies is, how does this haze form? What's it made of? And it'd be nice to understand, is it the same everywhere, or different layers made of different things? So we want to get some more detailed understanding of that haze. Okay, so I'm going to go through a little bit of the haze chemistry, and don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz later, and this is my perhaps only slide with chemistry. So it all starts with sunlight, in this case, interacting with the methane. And what happens then is that that sunlight is high energy and has enough energy to break the bonds of methane and form it into smaller, more reactive pieces. And these smaller pieces here can react again with more methane and grow into larger pieces. And you can keep growing and growing and growing and growing and growing, and eventually you get to something big enough so that it feels like it no longer wants to be a gas but condenses to a particle, and that could be one of the haze particles. Now, not only is this chemistry initiated by sunlight, but it also can be initiated by high-energy electrons. And as it turns out, Titan is sitting in Saturn's magnetosphere, so there's all these high-energy electrons around as well as photons, and those electrons can also break bonds. And when that happens, you might get all sorts of ion chemistry. So you don't need to see the details here, really. We just have nitrogen ions, so we've taken away an electron. Now that's got extra energy, and it can start reacting with methane, and you can get more and more and more and bigger ions. And in this case, one of the things you might see is benzene, and that's an aromatic ring that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And finally, the electrons have so much energy, they can actually break this bond in nitrogen. In our own Earth, you never break the nitrogen bond. It's a very, very strong bond, except if you're really high altitude. But in this case, the nitrogen ions can start participating in the chemistry, and they can even become incorporated into these organic molecules. And so you might have things like nitrogen-containing organics or nitriles in your particles. So this is really just all speculation, I have to say. You can write down any number of mechanisms, and you can say, well, there might be benzene, there might be nitriles, and there might be organics, but we don't really have any clue as to what there really is until we make some measurements. And so that's what we'd like to do, is understand what's the chemical composition of this haze. Okay. So to do this, we're a laboratory group, and so we made measurements in the laboratory. And the way we did this is we tried to simulate the actual atmosphere of Titan. So we started with mixtures of nitrogen and methane. Those are the two most abundant species on Titan. We mixed them overnight in a mixing chamber, and then we flow them into a reaction cell. Now once we're in that reaction cell, we can excite those, the reactants with any one of a number of different things. And these first experiments I'm going to show you, we're using electrons, high-energy electrons, to get the chemistry started. And then particles are made in this reaction cell just by adding some high-energy electrons. And what's really unique about our experiments are we then take these particles out and we analyze them in this instrument called an aerosol mass spectrometer. And this is really a remarkable instrument because most of the air here is just air, and we're trying to analyze particles which make up very little of the mass of what we're trying to analyze. And so the development of this instrument is really what allowed us to do these experiments. And this is an instrument that is now being used for current Earth studies. When you have a polluted day, well, of course, you never would have a polluted day here, but if you lived in Los Angeles and had a polluted day, you could take one of these aerosol mass spectrometers out, and you could determine, is it the power plant that's making these aerosols that you can't breathe, or is it just sea salt and there's nothing you can do about it? So this is a huge advance in our understanding of aerosols, and we've then taken this instrument and applied it to this particular study of Titan haze. So you take, go back, sorry. This is different than my controller. Of course, my controller doesn't work, so I shouldn't complain. Okay, so you take your aerosol sample and you focus it with a lens here, and you can see now our particles are going in a straight line, but the gas that's with these particles is all pumped away. We reduce the gas by 10 million times. So we're getting rid of all the gas, so we can just analyze the particles, and then the particles hit a heater, and we can analyze their chemical content using a mass spectrometer. And what's really special about this instrument, as I said, is we don't have to collect the haze particles. We can analyze them on the fly. So we don't have to touch them, and we don't have to alter them. And so this is really a remarkable instrument in that way. The way this instrument works, you have your particle, and after it's gone through the mass spectrometer, it hits a heater where it vaporizes all the molecules. And so what you have then are all these gas phase molecules that used to be in the particle. And then we cross those molecules with an electron beam, and they fragment into pieces. So in this case here, we could have this molecule here made of different pieces. And here's a benzene ring. It's got 6 carbons in a ring. We call this an aromatic structure. And then it's got some other pieces here that I've color-coded. And when you hit that with electrons, it might break into different fragments, the purple fragment, the green, and the yellow. And so what we'll see is all sorts of fragments, not of what the molecule is, but of how it broke up. And so what we're going to see is something incredibly complicated, and it just makes you want to throw up your hands and just give up. You can't possibly get any information. There's just too much information. Okay, so that's what we have to work with. Okay, so this is a typical aerosol mass spectrometer. So we're taking just the particles, get rid of all the gas. What's in those particles? Okay, well, this would be a typical thing that we would see. The first thing we see is, that the highest peak in the spectrum is mass 27, and that's HCN. So the only thing I want you to remember there is there's nitrogen. The biggest peak in the spectrum has nitrogen in it. Okay, so that's the only thing I want you to remember there. And let's look at what's in the rest of the spectrum. Well, here, what you see is this sort of picket fence pattern. Each one of these peaks is a fragment of some bigger molecule that's fallen apart. And our job is to figure out what this whole mess is. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to ignore almost all the peaks, and we're just going to look at in each envelope, what are the big peaks that stick out? Can we identify anything in this mess? And the amazing thing is that we actually can. So when we look at these first 3 envelopes, the biggest peaks are 39, 51, and 63. And those are peaks that are very typical of benzene, so the C6 aromatic hydrocarbon. We also go to these 2 envelopes, and we can actually pick out the peak for benzene and toluene. That's benzene, that's toluene. We can move up to the next envelopes. And here again, what we see is the peak for naphthalene. We can keep moving up. Here's 1-methylnaphthalene. And here's anthracene, that's 3 carbon rings. And pyrene, 4 carbon rings. And finally, these other envelopes here are fragments of bigger polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So what we're seeing in this spectrum is there's a lot of peaks, there's a lot going on, but out of the mess, you can pick out that the most important peaks are these things we call polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Okay, well, what are these? These are 6-membered rings fused together, and they fuse together in such a way that you can see how they're planar. And these are very, very stable compounds due to this structure. They're observed in the interstellar medium. They're observed in meteorites, comets. You're all probably very familiar with these. Naphthalene is the ingredient of mothballs. So they're called aromatics because you can smell them. Everyone knows that really awful mothball smell. Okay, so we're seeing in our laboratory data. Now just remember, we started with methane, CH4. That's all we started with, methane and nitrogen, and we get these huge molecules. Okay, so that's something we're seeing. Well, what else do we see? Okay, we're also starting with nitrogen. Do we see any nitrogen in the particles? Well, remember, I told you that that HCN peak was the biggest peak in the spectrum. And when we do experiments with argon and mess around and try to figure out how much of that peak is due to HCN, we can figure out that nitrogen had to, if you just use that one peak, the aerosols are 7% by mass nitrogen. And so what we're seeing is we're incorporating quite a bit of nitrogen into our aerosols. And it's thought that this nitrogen might be helping to stabilize these ring structures. Okay, so far we've seen we have these rings, and we've seen we have nitrogen. What else do we see? Well, we see that the particles are small. They're really small. They're about 50 nanometers. So here's a TEM image. Oh, no, I guess that's it, of the particles, and you can see they're about 50 nanometers in diameter. And if you think about this in terms of something you know, a piece of paper is about 100,000 nanometers thick. Okay, so these are really, really, really small particles. And the other thing that we've noted is that if you wait long enough, or if you have a lot of these particles, they agglomerate together in something that looks a little bit like soot. You have all these little particles that come together as a fractal aggregate that's much bigger, but the individual pieces are still 50 nanometers. Okay, so those are the things we've seen. We've seen that you can form haze by adding these high energy electrons. We also did this with a UV lamp, but I'm not going to show you that. We've seen that the haze contains aromatic hydrocarbons, also some non-aromatics that I didn't talk about. The particles contain nitrogen, and they're small, about 50 nanometers in diameter. Okay, does this have any resemblance to truth? Okay, well, a little. This is an artist's rendition of the Huygens descent. So remember, the Huygens descended. I should point out that we published our paper before the Huygens descended. Okay, so here we are. Here's an artist's rendition of the Huygens probe falling down through the atmosphere of Titan. And here it is. It's landed on this lovely beach. It just almost makes you want to be there, doesn't it? Okay, so on board the Huygens lander was the aerosol collector and pyrolyzer. And this was an instrument that was specifically designed to collect the particles and determine what they were, actually with a mass spectrometer, so kind of like our experiments. And what they expected to see was if these polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons were present, they expected a big benzene signal. And if nitrogen were present in the haze, they expected an HCN signal. Okay, so what did it actually see? Okay, well, indeed, the aerosol collector and pyrolyzer saw a big signal for ammonia and HCN. And so that is telling us there is nitrogen in those particles. So we got that one. Okay, it saw no organics. So that was kind of a mystery, and we'll come back to this. There pretty much has to be organics in these particles. If they were just ammonia and HCN, they wouldn't be particles, they'd be in the gas phase. So we think there's something that went amiss there. There must be organics, but it did not detect organics. And finally, an instrument called the Descent Imager and Spectral Radiometer was able to look at the optics of the particles and determine that they best fit the spectral signature if you assumed that they were fractal aggregates made of hundreds of little monomer balls, with each monomer being 50 nanometers. So that seems very familiar. Okay, so this organic problem, though, has us kind of worried. But luckily, there was another instrument on board that could detect organics. And that was very exciting. And it turns out this instrument was on Cassini itself. So Cassini is not landing. It's an orbiter. But it gets so close to Titan that it can actually, as it's passing through, pass through the actual atmosphere. And notice in this picture of Titan, look at all these layers of haze, just dark and light and dark and light. So Cassini, as it's orbiting around, it's just imagine it going like this, and it actually passes through the atmosphere itself. And on board Cassini is a mass spectrometer. Well, what does it see? It sees something that looks a lot more like our laboratory work. So here what we're seeing is the abundance of different mass peaks, and you see the same sort of picket fence pattern. Carbons, 2 carbons, 3 carbons, 6 carbons. There we have benzene. They actually, in subsequent passes, saw even more benzene, so they're detecting a lot of benzene. So all of these would be in the gas phase, but all of the building blocks for the haze are there. It's real high altitude. It's at 1,000 kilometers, so 600 miles, but the building blocks for the haze are all there. Cassini had another instrument on board that could measure the ions present at this altitude and also the electrons, and from that they could deduce a mass spectrum of even larger things, and this is what that instrument showed. So here again, this is the density, so the amount as a function of mass, and this is showing huge things. So here, where this red line is, they think they're detecting anthracene, and anthracene is the polycyclic aromatic with 3 carbon rings. And then they even think they're seeing an anthracene dimer, so 6 rings. And so Cassini is indeed seeing lots of organics, and organics that are so big, eventually here at 10,000 AMU, thank you, it would be considered a particle. So they are seeing organics. Okay, so let's now compare the lab studies with the field studies. So what did the Cassini-Huygens probe see? They saw benzene and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons very, very high up, because remember that's where Cassini is. These are the ingredients that then would make the haze, and this haze then would slowly settle to the surface of Titan. What I want to point out here for later reference is when you get to the coldest part of the atmosphere, methane might condense on these haze particles and form a methane cloud, or maybe even an ethane cloud, and that could end up raining down to Titan. Then the Huygens probe, which was making measurements much closer to the surface, measured nitrogen in the particles and also these fractal aggregates. And from our laboratory studies, we see essentially the same thing. When we use electrons to excite our methane and nitrogen, which would be what would happen at these high altitudes, we see benzene and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. The particles contain nitrogen, and they have the right size and shape to make up the monomers that are seen by the Huygens probe. So it seems like there's some sort of correlation between our laboratory observations and the actual observations on Titan. And with that, I'd like to then think about, well, might there be hazes in other places besides Titan? We know there's one at Titan. Okay, and as we do this, we can look at our solar system, and it turns out that on Jupiter there is a haze, and also on Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And so what this is saying is whenever you have methane in the atmosphere, a lot or a little, it seems like it's very easy to make a haze. Methane in the atmosphere and some sunlight, and you seem to be getting a haze. And that brings up the question of Earth. Not Earth today, but Earth long ago in its history. Could there have been methane in that atmosphere, and might there have been a haze on early Earth, and how would that have played into the development of life? Okay, so that's what we're going to look at next. So what do we know about Earth? Okay, well, the Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago, and very shortly after the formation, liquid water was evident on the early Earth. Life is a little more debatable, but it's thought that fossil life was first seen around 3.6 billion years ago. And some of the first forms of life are thought to be methanogens, and these are little microorganisms that give off methane. And the rise of oxygen didn't happen until much later, 2.2 billion years ago. And so what you can see is you have a very large period of time here where after you have liquid on the surface and you don't have oxygen. And so if you don't have oxygen, then you also don't have ozone. And so there'd be no UV shield from ozone or oxygen here. So if you do have life in this huge region, it probably developed underwater to protect it from the ultraviolet light. Okay, so this picture is problematic in one main way, and that is this idea of liquid water so soon after the formation of the Earth. And the reason that's problematic is because something known as the faint young sun paradox, and that's shown graphically here. So what I've shown is the temperature at the surface of the Earth, and that's this yellow curve, as a function of time, and that's this billions of years before present. So here we are at present, 0, and here we go back 3.5 billion years would be right about here. And if you look at the temperature of the surface of the Earth at this point, it's below the freezing point of water. And yet I told you at this time there was liquid water. And that's why this is known as a paradox. And the idea here is that the solar luminosity is increases with time. And so here we have the present day solar luminosity is given a value of 1. And if you go back 3.5 billion years, the solar luminosity was about maybe 3/4 of what it is today. And this seems to be true of all stars like our sun. And it's just an inevitable consequence of hydrogen fusing to helium. And so the sun gets more luminous with time. But what that means is if you go back here to 3.5 billion years ago and you assume that the atmospheric composition is the same then as it is now, then you would conclude that the temperature would be below the freezing point of water. Now you can solve this paradox quite readily by just getting rid of that assumption that the atmospheric composition is the same. If you allow that the atmospheric composition may have changed over time, you can overcome the faint young sun paradox. And what you'd need then is early in Earth's history more powerful greenhouse gases than we have today. Okay, well what might those greenhouse gases be? Well, I think if I was going to ask you what's a greenhouse gas, what's the greenhouse gas you would think of? CO2. Okay, so let's go with CO2. Okay, how much CO2 do we need to overcome the faint young sun? So here we have the CO2 partial pressure in units of bar. Remember, at sea level on Earth, 1 bar is our pressure. And this is, as again, a function of the time before present. So here at 4.5 billion years ago, for example, you would need over a bar of CO2 to overcome the faint young sun. So it would be like our current atmosphere, only no oxygen, no nitrogen, everything is CO2. So that's a lot of CO2. Okay, if you go on in time, you need less CO2 because remember the sun's getting more luminous. Now the problem is, in this region that I'm really interested in, which is sort of after life but before the rise of oxygen, there are some constraints on CO2. And the amount of CO2 that is thought to exist is less than what you'd need to overcome the faint young sun. And that brings up the idea that maybe the Earth was warmed not only by CO2, but by other greenhouse gases in addition to CO2. And the one that I'm going to be focusing on now is methane. And the reason for that is because some of that first life, and remember the fossil evidence for the first life was right here at around 3.5 billion years ago. That first life might have been methanogens. They give off methane, and without oxygen in your atmosphere, the methane would be very long-lived and could build up. Okay, so let's think about methane. But now we know something. We know if early Earth had methane, it probably had a haze, because every other planet that has methane has a haze. So we'll get to that in a second. Here is a graph of how much methane you would need to overcome the faint young sun. And what you can see is this is the temperature of the Earth as a function of the pressure of CO2. And here's the freezing point of water. So if you're below this in the green region, you would have, your planet would be frozen. If you're off to the right, you have too much CO2 and it violates the geologic record. And so you need to be in this left-hand quadrant in blue. And the way we can do that is with very modest amounts of both CO2 and methane. So 1/1000th of a bar of CO2 and 1/1000th of a bar of methane would get you a nice warm planet, 293 K above the freezing point of water. But this does bring up the problem that if you have methane, then you're likely to have a haze. But the haze might be a little different than we have on Titan. So this was the chemistry I showed you for Titan. I'm only showing you the chemistry that's initiated by sunlight because Earth is not in Saturn's magnetosphere, so we don't have those high energy electrons, we just have the sun. So this is the chemistry that's initiated by sunlight. And the question is, what happens when you add CO2 to that mix? Because we almost certainly did have CO2 early in Earth's history. And CO2 will also break bonds upon hitting it with ultraviolet sunlight, and you'll get O atoms. And it was thought that these O atoms could tie up the carbon atoms and terminate the chains, and you'd end up with less haze. And so our question that we set out to address is, we know there's a haze on Titan where you just have methane and nitrogen, but what about early Earth where you have all this CO2? Would a haze still form? It had been predicted that if you had equal amounts of methane and CO2, your haze formation would stop and you would not have haze formation. So we're going to look at that, and if you do have a haze, of course we'd like to know what the properties of that haze are. Okay, so here's the experiment. It's the same exact experiment as we did before. The only difference is that we added CO2 to our mixture, so we have nitrogen, methane, and CO2. And the other thing we did is we changed that electron source to just a UV lamp. So here we are. We're taking these just very, very simple gases, and we just shine a UV lamp on it. That's all we're doing. Okay? So what do we see? Well, this is, I'm just going to show you two mass spectra. In this case, on the top panel is what we see when we have a Titan-like mix. So just methane and nitrogen. And what you see is similar to what I showed you earlier when we excited with electrons. Not exactly the same, but similar. We see this picket fence kind of pattern with alkanes and alkenes. These are just carbon and hydrogen containing molecules. We also see benzene and toluene, so these are like the aromatics that will lead to the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So it's similar to what we already saw. But now the only thing we've done here is now we've added CO2. And when we add CO2, we see something that is actually quite different. Now the most important peak is this peak due to CO2. I keep hitting something. And that peak is very small in this top panel. And also we see less of these aromatics. And so what we've done by adding CO2 to the gas mix, that's all we've done, and a UV lamp, we go from a Titan aerosol that is mainly carbon and hydrogen to an early Earth aerosol that is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that oxygen is really, really important because if you have oxygen, it makes the organic material much more digestible. Like, what would you rather eat? Would you rather have some wax for dinner? That'd be like this. Or would you rather have sugar for dinner, which would be like this? Okay? Probably you'd rather have, something other than wax or sugar, but those are your choices today. Okay, so that's very important that we're able to add oxygen to our aerosols. Well, what about nitrogen? We saw that our Titan haze particles had nitrogen. What about these? Do they have nitrogen as well? Well, remember before I showed you one mass peak at mass 27, and I said, well, if we assume that's due to HCN, we can figure out how much nitrogen we have. Well, I don't have time to go into how this works, but we have the most amazing advance on our instrument that allows us to do a high-resolution study. And look at this. Now we have a mass spectrum. It's going from 26.95 to 27.05. So these are two different things that have basically the same mass. They both have mass 27, but they have a different exact mass. And so we can tell how much of each peak that look just like one peak is really HCN versus something else. And so we can get an exact amount of nitrogen in this material. And when we do that, we find an enormous amount of nitrogen, 16% mass by mass nitrogen in these haze particles. Also, we see chemicals that have oxygen and nitrogen in the same compound. And so this is reminding us of things like amino acids. And this is important because, of course, nitrogen is a key element of life, and these amino acids can make up proteins. And so all we're doing, again, we take CO2 and nitrogen and methane, shine a light on it, and we're getting really big things. And we didn't collect these in water. This is just in the air. This is just happening in the air. Okay, so how much haze do we get? Well, we get a lot. I just want to compare how much haze we get when we take our lamp and shine it on a pure nitrogen-methane mixture to one when we shine it on methane, nitrogen, CO2. And that's this graph here. Remember, the modelers all said, well, if you have an equal amount of CO2 and methane, you're going to cut off haze production. Well, when we do this, when we have an equal amount of methane and CO2, we actually get more haze production than with methane alone. Now, eventually, if we have a ton of CO2, we start to lower the amount of haze we see. But we basically have a very robust conclusion here. Almost under every circumstance of methane and CO2 and nitrogen, no matter how we mix the mix, we see haze being formed. So we think that's a very robust conclusion. Okay, so what have we seen? We've seen that we can irradiate mixtures of methane and CO2 and we get particles. It doesn't matter what our mix is. The particles form even when we have a lot of CO2. So we think these particles might have been present on Earth for maybe 2 billion years. Particles over vast periods of time, maybe different particles over time, but particles at all times. Oxygen might even enhance the particle formation. The particles contain oxygen and nitrogen. I didn't show this, but the particles are still small and spherical. And because they're made of different stuff, they're going to be a little different than those Titan particles. Okay, so what I want to do now is think about what might this mean for life on Earth. And this is where the talk gets a little fuzzy, and I love this quote from Mark Twain about this. There's something fascinating about science. One gets such wholesale returns of conjecture out of such a trifling investment of fact. And so what I've shared with you so far is what I'm going to be considering the fact, and I hope you'll indulge me as I get into the conjecture part of this talk. Okay. The first thing I want to ask is, how much haze are we talking about? How much haze might there be on early Earth? Okay. Well, what we're going to do to get this is we're going to start with how much haze there is on Titan, which is a measured number, so that's a good number. And this is the maybe scary part. We're going to do some scaling. There's more sunlight on early Earth, well, mainly because we're so much closer to the sun than is Titan, so we have more sunlight, so we're going to get more haze. We have less methane, so that'll give us less haze. And when you add CO2, it changes the amount of haze a little. And when we do this and predict then how much haze we'd have on early Earth, we get some number of grams per centimeter squared per second, and we can multiply by the surface area of the Earth and get a number of grams per year. Okay, so we have 10 to the 13 to 10 to the 15 grams of haze that we're producing per year. Okay, so what does that mean? Is that big? Is that small? I don't know. Not a number itself doesn't have much meaning. You have to compare it to other numbers. So let's do that. Okay, well, the haze produced in the atmosphere, we said, is this 10 to the 13 to 10 to the 15 grams per year. If we look at other sources for complex organics on the early Earth, two sources that people think about are delivery from space and also formation in hydrothermal vents, and those are much smaller, 2 to the 11th grams per year. And so what we're seeing is this mechanism where we're just shining light on the atmosphere can make more complex organics than produced in some of the other known pathways. So that seems like we're making a lot of organics. You can look at this a different way. We could think about, so here's the haze produced in the atmosphere. I just took the average 10 to the 14th grams per year. If you look at all the people in the world, you put us all on a big scale, we'd weigh about 5 times 10 to the 14 grams. And so what this is saying is you're making like the mass of all the people in the world every year. Okay, so to me that sounds like a lot of haze. But you can look at it another way. Okay, so here's a picture of Mount St. Helens before the eruption in 1980, and here is what it looks like after it erupted. And the mass that was lost in that Mount St. Helens eruption was about 10 to the 15 grams, which is interesting. That's more than the mass of all the people. That means we could all, if we all wanted to get real close, we could all just hop right in here. Everybody on the world could fit right in that crater. And so what this is sort of like, though, is Mount St. Helens erupting every year. Now, I don't know if any of you remember this, but after a major eruption, in particular this eruption, we had beautiful sunrises and beautiful sunsets. The sky was red all the time for a couple of years because of the particles that were in the atmosphere. And that brings up the idea of, well, if you really had this much haze, would the sky look different? So here's my little schematic of what Earth might look like to an outsider, and here's how it looks, of course, today. If you had a really thick haze, like the kind of hazes I've been talking about, it might look kind of like Titan. But remember, I did tell you that the haze is made out of different material. It has oxygen in it and less polycyclic aromatics, so it might be a different color. Or maybe, we're off by a few orders of magnitude and the haze is thinner, and so maybe you could still see the Earth through the haze. But so Earth might have looked very different. This haze could have also affected the climate of early Earth, and that's what I'm showing here. This idea was first put forward by Carl Sagan and Chris Chiba in 1997, and they were trying to solve the faint young sun paradox by having methane and ammonia in the atmosphere to serve as greenhouse gases. The problem with that is that sunlight quickly breaks apart the methane and ammonia, and the gases would be destroyed in 100 years, so you could have a greenhouse for 100 years, but then nothing. So their idea was that the methane would also make this organic haze, and it could protect the molecules below from photolyzing and reacting away, and you could have a nice greenhouse effect. So that was their idea, that you could have a thick haze layer, and that would prolong the lifetime of ammonia long enough to have a nice green planet. A problem with that is that if you have a thick haze, you're also going to have something called an anti-greenhouse effect. And what that is that the sun will be both absorbed by these particles, if they're orange particles, and reflected off them. And so less sunlight will get to Earth. And if less sunlight gets to Earth, of course, the planet will go below freezing and freeze over. So that's a problem. And we've said that we think we're going to have a lot of haze. And if you have a lot of haze, then we're in this situation where we should have a frozen planet. So that's not good. But there is a way around this, and that is shown schematically here. So in the picture of the atmosphere that I've presented to you, which I'm now calling the old picture, nitrogen was very abundant, CO2 was abundant, there was methane in the atmosphere, and low levels of hydrogen. This is a log scale, so actually low levels of hydrogen. Well, it turned out in a paper recently in Science showed that the hydrogen escape rate had been overestimated for early Earth, and so there might actually be quite a bit more hydrogen on the early Earth than we previously thought. And so in the new picture of early Earth, you have nitrogen, and then hydrogen is actually the second most abundant gas with a ratio of over 10%. So like 10% of the Earth's atmosphere would be hydrogen. You wouldn't want to light a match. So there we are. Now, hydrogen itself is not a greenhouse gas, so this would not directly affect the climate, but it could affect the haze. And that's what we see when we do these experiments now with a new mix. We have CO2 and methane, and ask how much aerosol mass do we get as we add hydrogen. What we see is with no hydrogen, we get a lot of aerosol mass, and as we add hydrogen, we get less aerosol mass. Although we always get aerosols. No matter how much hydrogen we add, we always see aerosols. So again, we still think this haze on early Earth is a robust conclusion. However, having the hydrogen helps us a lot because we don't have as much haze. And that can help then in determining this anti-greenhouse effect. What's shown here now is the surface temperature as you add greenhouse gas. So adding methane is the greenhouse gas. And what you'd expect is if there's no haze, you add greenhouse gas and it gets warmer. And of course that's what we're operating on today. You add CO2, it's going to get warmer. Okay, so that's what we see here. And in our first experiments that I showed you for early Earth, when we had a thick haze forming from methane and CO2, we added greenhouse gas, but we got so much haze, the anti-greenhouse effect dominated, and we never got below this freezing point of water. So in this case, if this were actually going on, we'd have a frozen planet. In contrast, when you then add hydrogen, you get less haze. You still get haze, but less haze, so that as you add methane now in the presence of hydrogen, you can get above this freezing point of water, and you would have a liquid planet. And so what that's telling us is that the hydrogen allows the haze to form. It still has carbon, it still has hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, it's still digestible, but you don't have so much that you freeze the planet over. So it's just like, not too much, not too little, it's just right. Okay, so we think we have this haze. So I think that's actually fairly robust, that assuming the atmosphere is anything like the atmosphere I've talked about, there's probably going to be a haze. Well, what does that mean for life? Okay, well, life as we know it requires the following three ingredients. You need water. Water's a good solvent for life. We're made up mostly of water. You need energy to sustain that life. And you need organics, because that's what life is made of on Earth. So those are what we need. And in the picture of then how life was on early Earth, what we see is that we didn't have oxygen and ozone in that early Earth, and so whatever life there was probably originated underwater. And to have the nutrients that we needed for that life, the life might have been localized to very special environments, such as hydrothermal vents. And there's been a lot of attention on the origin of life in hydrothermal vents so that you could have those nutrients. Well, the new picture of early Earth still has the same situation. No oxygen, no ozone, so life is underwater. But instead of oxygen and ozone, now we're thinking of an atmosphere with nitrogen, CO2, hydrogen, and methane, and sunlight shining down on those. And when sunlight hits that gas mixture, what happens is you get this haze. And now this haze is everywhere because, of course, the gases are well mixed. They're everywhere. The sun is everywhere. And so you get these organic molecules raining down globally. And so you have a global source of alcohols, sugars, amino acids, the building blocks of life. And so you have a global source of organic nutrients, and so now life can flourish perhaps everywhere. Instead of specialized environments, you might have life in every little puddle on Earth. Okay, well, when you talk about life, there is one place that we know in our solar system for sure has life. And that would be right here on Earth. Okay, so what we want to think about is, okay, could there be life other places? And specifically, we're going to be thinking in these last few moments about Titan. And so what I've shown here are two photographs from space, one of Earth and one of Titan. And the thing that strikes me about this is just really how familiar they both seem. So here on the left, I have a picture of some hills in Arizona, and over here is an image that the Huygens probe took as it was descending. And it's just remarkable. You can see sort of this white surface that's thought to be ice, water ice on the surface. And then you see these river channels. And what's thought to be going on here is that this is very strong evidence for methane rain. So the methane, and so the organic haze particles are falling through methane rain. Methane particles coat on those and turns into methane rain. It falls to the ground and washes out these organic materials into this river channels, and that's why they're darker, and then it empties out into a basin here. And so we clearly think that there's not only organics in the atmosphere of Titan, but there's organics on the surface. So there's one thing that we have on Titan for life. You have organics. The problem with Titan is it's really cold. It's really, really cold. So its temperature at the surface is about 95 Kelvin. This is a photograph, again, from the Huygens probe. What happens, a little fuzzy, but when the Huygens probe descended, it kind of found this soggy surface and went a little splash. And when it had that little soggy splash, a big puff of methane appeared. A big puff of methane appeared, and that's again evidence for this rain on Titan, so a soggy surface. And this picture has all these pebbles. These pebbles are thought to be ice. They're about 6 inches in diameter. And again, the light is dim because of the haze. So again, we have lots of organics. We probably have methane rain. But the problem is this liquid water problem, because it's so cold that any water would be ice. And if you had rivers and oceans, they wouldn't be water. They'd be liquid methane. So here's an example of one lake on Titan, and what you can see is it's a big lake. It's the size of Lake Superior. Okay, so it's just the same size, but whereas Lake Superior is made out of water, these lakes on Titan are methane or maybe methane and ethane mixtures. And so while the rain in Spain falls mainly on the plains, the rain on the plains of Titan is mainly methane. Okay, so we don't have liquid water. We do have liquid methane and ethane. So maybe you could think of some crazy way for life to get going there. But another interesting finding, and this really has only been coming out in the last years, is this idea of possible cryovolcanism on Titan. And and the idea here is that Cassini had various flybys over the years of Titan and saw that the surface was changing. So it'd fly by in 2004 and get all these pictures. Then by 2006, it looked different. So the Titan is resurfacing. It's changing as Cassini is flying by. And one idea to explain this is this idea of cryovolcanism. And in that picture, what happens is there's water and ammonia under the surface. There's radiogenic heating, and that causes this eruption of water and ammonia and methane into the atmosphere. And incidentally, this would help the understanding of Titan, because it would give us a continuous source of methane. Otherwise, the methane you would expect might photolize away in about 10,000 years. But we think there's been methane over geologic timescales on Titan. And so this is really interesting, because you'd have this water and ammonia cryovolcanism, and it could possibly make a liquid ammonia water mix, and it's been estimated that that mixture could remain liquid for thousands upon thousands of years. One estimate even suggested 100,000 years. And so then that brings up the idea, well, there's definitely organics, and there is a heat source, and maybe there might be periods of time where there was liquid water, and so people are very excited. Well, could that mean that somewhere there is life? And of course, this is highly speculative at this point, no one knows, but it's an interesting idea. Okay, in closing, I want to thank some of the people that I've worked with on this. In particular, I've had great fortune to work with Melissa Traynor, a postdoc in my lab. Krista Hesenkopf and Langley DeWitt are both graduate students in my group. I've had a lot of collaborators all over the place, and NASA has been very generous in funding my work, both the NASA Exobiology group and also NASA Planetary Atmospheres. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Tolbert, for giving us a wonderful lecture and showing us how you can bring great clarity to the topic of hazes and its importance to our own planet. By tradition, we take a few questions of the speaker. There, as some of you have already noticed, microphones in the aisles. And why don't we start with the gentleman over here?
Are there any constraints on the environmental requirements of the methane-producing life forms to kickstart things?
So you want to know details about the actual methanogens?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't know that answer to that. I mean, if this is true, this picture, then they have to give off methane. So that would be one constraint. But there is evidence from the isotopic record, when you look at the carbon isotopic record, that there were actually methanogens present very, very early in Earth's history. So I guess that's a constraint, but I don't really know the detailed answer to your question.
You, sir.
You mentioned the radiogenic heating. I've read speculation about tidal friction being intense on these moons, at least of Jupiter. Is that a possibility for Titan?
I think that is a possibility. The radiogenic heating, I think, is actually, I mean, there's good evidence for that in actually the argon measurements. When the Huygens probe descended, it was looking at all these gases, and it didn't measure any non-radiogenic argon. And that told us that the primitive atmosphere probably wasn't nitrogen but was ammonia. But they did measure argon, radiogenic argon, and so that seems to be evidence for the radioactive heating. So I think there could also be this tidal energy, but I'm not really sure about that.
Yes.
Can you tell from your studies, in other words, nitrogen and carbon have to be created by giant novas, like, and explosions and stuff from the hydrogen. And can you tell from isotopes whether or not that stuff out there at Saturn came from the same pot as the stuff on Earth? And could it be because the sun is further away from them? They'll be studying us one day to understand, try and understand whether there was life on us. But I'm really interested in that pot of and what was the origin? In other words, do you get Earth and Saturn coming around the same time, or are there, what's the time?
So this is like all way beyond my chemical knowledge. The only thing I can say is in our solar system, argon should be about 10% of nitrogen. Okay, that's what it should be. And yet it isn't on Titan. And so that is telling us that it did not, the nitrogen on Titan did not come from the same place as the nitrogen on Earth. So that we know by looking at these ratios and the isotopes as you suggest. So we know that the nitrogen is not the original nitrogen. And so that's led to this idea, and in fact is important for this whole cryovolcanism, that led to the idea of ammonia being the original nitrogen holder. And this is important because although I presented this as if there's ammonia on Titan, ammonia has not actually been detected on Titan. And so the idea that there is all this ammonia is really a result of the fact that the nitrogen can't be the original nitrogen because of the argon ratio. So there is information there from cosmic abundances. But that's about at the level I'm able to answer your question.
Thank you.
We'll take your question.
Okay, this is actually two. You didn't explain why, when the Huygens probe was going through the atmosphere, didn't it see any carbon, even though you said there are 50 nanometer sized particles there, number one. Number two, going back to the first question about the methanogens, if you said that the theory was that the methanogens generated the methane that melted the ice, but if there was no water and it was all ice, how could the methanogens live to give off the methane which defrosted the planet?
Okay, so I'll start with that one. That's an excellent point. Most of our work has focused on this time period after the origin of life, and that's because we feel like we can get a good handle on how much methane there is because we have modern bacteria and we know how much methane a modern methanogen would give off, and so we can estimate it. So most of our work on purpose did not deal with the origin of life, yet we focused on the habitability of Earth at that time period after life. Now, your question, though, is excellent. What about before the origin of life? Well, there would still be some methane sources. The problem is those methane sources are so poorly constrained, we really have no idea what they would be. And so we've done experiments with like 10 times less methane or 100 times less methane. We still see a haze that would warm the planet. So we think just with volcanic methane, there might be enough. However, there's not a good handle or proxy, so we don't really know how much methane there would be. So that's that. What was the first question?
Why didn't you see the organics?
Oh, well, okay, well, I was like in graduate school when they were designing this instrument. So it's not that I didn't see it. Why didn't they see the organics? You know, I think that the instrument, there must have been, if you look at the data, you can barely see the nitrogen in these particles. There's a lot of background. So what you're doing is you're taking the background and the gas and subtracting it to try to get the aerosol signature. And in our lab, which was done with much more modern technology, we had this lens that could separate the particles from the gases, but they didn't have any of this. These instruments were designed so long ago, and I think they just couldn't separate out the gases from the particles that well.
So the nitrogen background is the carbon, if there was any there.
Well, you saw even in my spectrum, the nitrogen signals were bigger than the actual intensity of the peaks were bigger than the carbon peaks, just because it's easier to ionize it. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily more nitrogen than carbon. It's just those peaks are a little bigger, and you're pushing the noise on those instruments. I think you just couldn't see the carbon above the noise. But I think it's there. I think they just couldn't detect it. They didn't have the sufficient signal to noise, and it was a disappointing result that they weren't able to see it.
Let's take one last question.
This might be a little beyond the scope of your discussion. There's often been speculation about Titan being a future home for Earthlings when the sun begins to die out. I was wondering if anybody has taken your models and moved them a little further into the future with a dying sun.
I don't think so. I mean, it's cold on Titan now, so I guess I'm not that optimistic. I think